In this room who haven't met me before, I'm Paul Madeley. I'm a PhD organic chemist by training. I studied at Nottingham under Professor Jerry Pattenden quite a long time ago. My career, like John's, started in pharma some time ago. I joined Boots in 1977 as a school leaver, and after ONC, HNC, went through a more conventional academic route. I always start my talks by giving this picture of the Blue Mountains in Australia. For those of you who haven't been lucky enough to go and see them in person, they're about 50 kilometres inland from Sydney, and it took the white settlers 26 years to penetrate the interior of Australia, because most of them were convicts and not allowed out from their day jobs, obviously. But when they got there, they found cattle, the descendants of cattle that they brought with them. The cattle had strayed down the coast and walked up the escarpment and taken the easy route. And the message really to take home from this is sometimes there's an easier way to get to where you want to go, and I'm in favour of that. So, okay, first lesson. So what am I going to talk about? Well, I'll tell you a little bit about who I am and what I do. Try and set the scene, just remind one or two in the audience perhaps why we do it, and then give you some tools I've used over the past 17 years in external contract manufacture and service acquisition. And I think it was Hash this morning who said that the rules change according to the nature of the project, and that's something I want to stress as we go through. Okay, so Synthesis. Who or what is Synthesis? Well, the company was formed in 2004, so we've just celebrated our 7th birthday. Over 30 years experience in large and virtual pharma. I've worked for Boots, Courtauld, Abbott, in the big company arena, British Biotech, OSI, in the more virtual biotech arena. Over 25 years experience of chemical process development, which has encompassed, the last count, over 600 processes and over 100 projects. So I think I know what I'm talking about, but I'm always willing to learn. We offer consultancy services to emerging pharma and biotech companies in small molecule chemical development, so from candidate selection through to commercial production. I don't discover new molecules, but if you've got a target that you think you want to make, then that's when I come in. So I can identify contractors, negotiate and manage contracts if that's what you need, engage in the tech transfer, and then at the end of it all, compile the CMC regulatory dossier for submission, and if you want additional suppliers, the supply chain risk analysis and backup suppliers, sing the theme, tune, etc. Okay, setting the scene. Again, another photograph of my holidays in Australia. Sydney Harbour Bridge. It used to take half a day to transport material by rail from the north to the south shore of Sydney. The Harbour Bridge means we can now do it in 2 minutes. Sometimes you can use technology to make life easier as well. Okay, setting the scene then, a reminder. Animal tox clinically and phase 1, they're all safety studies answering the question, is it safe, how much can we give and how often? Phase 2, we're worried about efficacy, does it work? Phase 3, effectiveness, is it better than standard if a standard exists? And then we have the licensing process, and phase 4, post-marketing surveillance. Now, the material requirements throughout this increase as we progress left to right. I feel it's important that the tox batch should reflect as closely as possible that which we intend to use down here. Historically, we might have 2 or 3 routes of synthesis to progress from left to right. The genotox risks and other complications of repeating toxicology over and again, and the risks, the inherent risks of statistically significant failures means really you're putting a lot of risk up front, and usually, for want of spending an extra month in the laboratory, you can find yourself constrained for years because nobody dares make a change. So I will come to my plea on that in a moment. But the whole process is very expensive. Demassi's report in 2003 showed, an average cost. These are, I think, the CMC costs of $897 million per molecule. If you believe Bain and Co. and you factor in all of the failures and prototypes that fall along the wayside, it's 1.7 billion. Huge sums to play with, and it's a little bit like an accumulator bet on the horses. You get a chance to invest, let's say 5.2 million in your animal studies. That enables you to go into phase 1, and the value will enhance, or you'll lose everything. You'll lose your shirt, And so this ends up as a series of investments and binary decision points. So you can invest maybe 50 million in an R&D program designed to give you a preclinical candidate, and it either succeeds, and you might have an asset worth 100 million, or it fails, and you get nothing. You might then invest 16 million in phase 1, and there's a 40% chance of success, and the asset may have gone up in value. Don't believe the green numbers, I made them up just for illustration. So don't get hung up in the actual values. But you've just got a series of steps where you can lose your shirt or enter the next league of the game. And many of my clients want to work in the arena phase 2 proof of concept, jettison the project to a big pharma who's going to gleefully purchase it. Well, it all depends on how you treat the program as to whether or not anyone will want to buy it. And that's something I want to stress in the next few slides. Okay, so a series of binary decisions leading to these go, no-go decision points. So first of all, you've got to understand the objective. Why are we doing this? Each project is different. Are we talking about a generic second source API where we've got an existing recipe, all the validation data? That's comparatively easy to outsource. You can take the entire recipe book over to a third-party manufacturer. Here we are, guys. How much are you going to charge me a kilo? And I want X tons by this date. Or are we talking about a new chemical entity? In which case, which phase of development? Because the factors change as we progress through it. What's the target indication? What's the market size likely to be? What about the dosing? Are we talking about 10 grams a day, 10 milligrams a day, 10 micrograms a day? 3 orders of magnitude different between each of those. Radically different equipment needed, perhaps radically different suppliers needed. Okay, what about the patient population? If it's diabetes or Alzheimer's, it's likely to be a big ticket, large volume project, maybe hundreds of tons, possibly even 1,000 tons. If it's something small like AML, there may be a few tens of kilos, possibly 100 kilos. The interest to the contract manufacturer may be radically different according to those volumes. What about the target product profile? Are we looking at an oral dose or a parenteral dose? Do we need sterile API? That, limits the number of contractors quite significantly. What success criteria are we looking for? Once a day dosing, multiple dosing, hospital administration. Each project is different, and you have to factor the contracts for external manufacture around those requirements, which means your wish list for contractors changes. Are we looking to file an IMPD or an IND? European US requirements are very slightly different, but significantly so. Are we looking to file an NDA or MAA? Same applies. Are we looking to sell the project or sell the product? Again, different requirements. But we've got to understand the ultimate customer requirements, by which I mean the patient, and en route to the patient, who's going to buy the program from you at the end of phase 2 proof of concept. If you don't have an understanding as to who, what their requirements are, you may be wasting a lot of time and effort focusing in the wrong areas. And so begin with the end in mind. That means effective project management. The electronic CTD is basically a series of electronic pigeonholes into which data must be fed. So you can answer the questions as you go for a lot of that and focus on the core things. Now, I don't want to delude everyone that all you have to do is fill in the CTD and away you go. There are a lot of non-regulatory safety and environmental factors that must also be considered in a manufacturing process. But a lot of it is factored in that way. So you avoid non-core activities if possible and do what I would term the prudent minimum. And with biotechs with limited funding, this is particularly important. We want a robust supply chain. That's really what we're going to sell downstream. And I think, again, it was Hash this morning who spoke about that. If you want to sell a program to Big Pharma, you want to have everything in line for Big Pharma to be a willing customer. Okay? So the requirements of the purchaser need to be clearly understood. The other factor, as I think John alluded to this morning, does the customer really know what he or she wants? Frequently, my clients consist of small companies, 2 to 20 employees. They may not have any chemists. They may know aspects of the process. They may be world leaders in those aspects, but frequently they don't understand chemical process development matters or the regulatory process in depth. So we need to have a conversation and write down their requirements in depth, and that's going to form the basis of a request for quotation. You called it an RFP, but this is what we mean. Okay, do they have unrealistic time demands? Very often I'll walk into a customer meeting for the first time. We've announced that we're going to be in the clinic by Easter 2012, and today, the 23rd of November, we haven't even got a manufacturing route. Please, please don't make these promises until you at least have some idea how you're going to manufacture, because you're on a hiding to nothing. And what will usually happen is, as we approach this key deadline, we'll be forced to make decisions which are not in the best interest of your project, not really in the best interest of your company. So a little pragmatism is needed. Many of my clients have a lack of finance. You know, they don't have any money for process development, but they want the CMO to fix all the problems. Well, there's a reality check needed for the customers as well as to what they can and can't expect. And again, you know, if you're in the position of being a consultant or an external person looking to manufacture, what do you want as the purchaser of this project? You need to know that before contacting the outside world. You know. Sum it up, you know, from the contractor. Does he or she speak your language? Literally, in these days of global outsourcing, and the level of understanding that they show will be largely dictated by how much background information you give them. If you don't tell them everything, don't blame them if they don't give you what you want. You know, they need to understand, why are we doing this? What do we hope to achieve? What's the desired end result? How quickly do I need to effect the transfer? And people at Pfizer 25, 30 years ago had a marvelous saying, why is there never enough time to do it properly, but there's always enough time to do it again? Well, this is the expensive way of doing it. If you get it right first time, you will save time, you will save money. I think, John, you mentioned this as well. If any of you feel you've heard a lot of this before, you have throughout the day. Okay, I'm going to do a quick straw poll. How many people in this room see a young woman? How many look at this picture and see an old woman? How many people see this picture and see both a young woman and an old woman? Thank you. And how many people have seen me use this slide before? Okay. Yeah, is it the young woman in profile? This is her cheek, this is her ear, you can see the tip of her nose and an eyelash. Or is it the old crone with the big nose and a slit for a mouth, and this is a baggy eye and the bag under the other eye? Yeah. This is a simple two-dimensional image. If different people in this room can misinterpret a simple two-dimensional image, just think what fun you'll have with a chemical batch record, or an analytical method, you know, or one of Gavin's protocols. Many people throughout the day have stressed the multidisciplinary nature of drug development. Today I'm going to focus on chemistry, okay? But many of the points I raise are applicable across the board. So, tools for contractor selection. What do I look for in a supplier appraisal? I have worked with well over 50 contract manufacturing organisations throughout Europe, the US, and the Far East. And so I do have a list of people that I have successfully worked with before to call upon. But the first thing I would advise anyone to look for is a track record. Has your chosen contractor got a track record of providing this type of service? If the answer is no, don't go to see them. Save the airfare, spend it more wisely. And then, on the commercial organisation, is there an established management team? Are they used to working together? Is contract manufacture or contract service provision part of their core business? Or are they simply letting you have access to a bit of equipment on a short-term basis, and next year when the blockbuster is launched, you'll be kicked out? How stable is the business? Now that's a hard question in the new environment of mergers, acquisitions. There's a lot of capacity out there, and those of you who went to Frankfurt to CPHI will know a huge number of companies are chasing what seems to be a diminishing amount of business at the moment. What about the legal and contractual side? How long did it take you to get the CDA sorted out? How responsive are they when you shift the goalposts? And everybody moves the goalposts at some point. The RFQ is a discussion document to get the ball rolling. By the time you've held meeting number 3, you will have completely changed your mind as to what you really want, because investors and other external forces will have forced your hand. How responsive is this company to these changing demands? Because that is a sign of how the relationship's going to work in the future. Quality systems. What quality systems are in operation? The earlier stages don't have to be manufactured in accordance with GMP. ISO is a nice to have. Some form of quality system should be in evidence. I want to know how pure the raw materials that go into the process are, even if you haven't paid somebody a fortune in accreditation to some national standard. I want to see evidence of a system. CGMP for the latest steps and certainly before the clinic. Any other regulatory? We live in one of the most highly regulated industries, and health, safety, environmental are but a few. REACH, each year more regulations seem to come to constrain the way we operate. What about the capacity of this company now and for the future? Is this going to see you through preclinical phase 1, but you'll have to switch horses at phase 2? That involves risk. Can they see you all the way through? If you've done due diligence properly and you know the factors pertinent to the project, such that ultimately 100 tons is going to be required, if you can find a contractor who has small-scale manufacturing into pilot, followed by large-scale manufacturing, it's a one-stop arrangement, and it should serve you for the long term. Again, a number of speakers throughout the day have highlighted this. Okay. What about the validation status of the equipment? No point in running your phase 3 clinicals and getting ready for commercial production if no one's thought to validate the equipment. It's surprising, even 20 years after the FDA moved the rule book and introduced the V word, some companies still haven't validated their equipment. What about other projects? What about your backup program? Could these people also work on the plan B molecule? Will it fit? Won't it fit? And again, I think Hash this morning mentioned switching IMP supplier, and they then went on to work for multiple projects. Okay. What about the resources available? Equipment, people, external, It's important that things get done. It doesn't all have to be done in-house. But if there's a system in place and a collaborative arrangement that you can piggyback on, it just makes management of the process easier. Is the appropriate infrastructure in place? Are they good at tech transfer, or do you need to come and install the process? which is a lot more cost to the client if I have to do it rather than simple email and teleconference. Okay? Do they have knowledge and experience of process development, analytical development? In the early days, these are really critical. If you're outsourcing second supply and all the recipes are there, it's much easier. So all this is summed up at the bottom. We want the ability to work together in a cohesive, focused team, all pulling in the same direction. Okay? Or another way of putting it is, we want to achieve our goals with the minimum resource input from our side. Okay? In terms of summarising your findings, you can come up with really elaborate questionnaires if you want. I've just shown here a 5-point summary diagram. You can have as many questions to this as you like and award points. Really, your gut feel probably works just as well as a 500-page document, and the CRO will feel rather more kindly disposed to you if you don't inflict 500-page questionnaires on him or her. But you can very easily map the results for a given contractor in something like this, and you can have as many axes on the spider web as you like, but you can put two side by side, and in this particular illustration, perhaps they're a little weaker in commercial and technology transfer, quality systems might need a bit of work. You see instantly where the management of the process may be required. Okay? And you can compare 2 or 3 side by side very quickly and efficiently to make your decision as to who to go with. Okay? It's a critically important strategic decision. Choosing the contractor, I think, Andy, you mentioned dating agencies. John, you spoke about marriage. Yeah, it's a long-term collaborative arrangement that you're getting into. And where you go is strategic, even if you choose a tactical supplier, because it's a decision, I'm going to be short-termist with this part of the program, i.e. tactical, I need a kilo now. I'll go to Aldrich. Next year, I'll go to the Aldrich supplier and I'll buy 25, 100 kilos. Okay? So, if you think marriage is expensive, just look at divorce. You don't want to make a habit of it, and I'm reminded of the story of the couple who, after an intense row, the husband asked his wife, what would you like for your birthday, darling? And she said, a divorce. Oh, I wasn't thinking of spending that much. Okay, so match the contractor to the project. One size does not fit all. I know, Venkat, you tried to make one fit all very, very closely this morning, but I think, as a former pilot plant manager, it didn't matter how many toys I had in the cupboard, a project would come along the next year, which meant I had to suddenly acquire a new one. And outsourcing gives us all the opportunity to go to the guy who has the right toy for the length of time I need it. At preclinical, we want pragmatism. We want things to move quickly. As we get closer and closer to NDA, we want control and consistency. Different mindsets, different staff, maybe within the same organization, but always get references and testimonials for new contract manufacturing organizations. With every new project, I will always go and have a face-to-face with the guys that I've recommended will do the work, because we want to make sure that everything fits closely. If they come back, I think, John, you gave the illustration of a work plan. You want to know how many steps over what time period. If suddenly we've got 10 steps of hydrogenation, perhaps their hydrogenation kit is a little limited. It's a flag. Okay, so always audit before placing an order for API as well. Capture the relationship in a contract. I think, Andy, you mentioned, the lead time for contracts can be very long, frequently 3 months, so start early. Yeah, and once you've managed to climb into bed with someone and sort out this contract, try and use it as often as possible if you can recycle it, because you've set up the working relationship at great cost. What sort of things do we outsource? Well, medchem, increasingly. Radiosynthesis, it's specialist, and not everyone wants to or is able to handle it in-house. Safety, calorimetry, explosivity, toxicology. You know, most unlikely to have that in a small biotech company. And there are insurance ramifications on the data, so it's best to cover yourself and go to an appropriate supplier. Polymorphism and physical form, absolutely critical. Don't go in the clinic without some knowledge of polymorphism, salts, and physical form. Usually, we're talking about intermediates and API synthesis. I'm not going to go into any specific detail on cytotoxic and high potency APIs, but they are an added layer of complexity that the others don't have. Analytical method development is absolutely critical in the early phase. You wouldn't put on a blindfold and attempt to drive to the office and expect to arrive in one piece, would you? So don't run chemistry that way. You need tools to understand what's going on, what byproducts are forming. If you cook until done, what does done mean? And also stability, bioburden, heavy metals, you know, various things need to be factored in. Does your contractor understand the language? Have they come into this as a fine chemicals company, in which case they know very little about downstream, or have they come in from the pharma end, in which case they know everything about the path to the marketplace and can give you free consultancy? Other things, reference standards, byproducts, metabolites. Okay, so early phase requires flexibility. Later phase, we don't worry because the process should be under control. The knowledge of downstream requirements reflects who you're talking to. If they're amateurs, well-meaning, you'll pay a fortune, but you won't really get where you want to go. Lots of companies offer polymorphism studies. Many of them mean we'll do recrystallization studies and tell you what the yield and purity is. They don't really understand polymorphism. Gather the data along the way. Transferring processes involves risk. Don't make a habit of it. If you found somebody you can work with who can do the whole thing, you've de-risked the path and you've actually added value for the next customer in the chain. The RFQ, what should go into the RFQ? Well, first of all, a tech transfer package. Everything you know about the recipe to that date in time. A clear list of deliverables, the plan. Okay? This is what we want to get out of it. And don't forget the analytical support. If they promise the analytical support but then disclose, oh, it takes place 30 miles away, the alarm bell should ring. You want people working side by side and able to provide the service and react to the data very quickly. Okay. We want a breakdown of cost and time for each activity, because frequently the polymorphism line may be teased out. The difference between an amateur job and a professional job is not that great, and I'd rather spend 5,000 extra and have a professional do it, thank you very much, because it's a litigious area, and if you're going to end up in court, you want the name of somebody competent and credible on the report. Put in a deadline for submission of proposals. As John said, 5 business days is perhaps unreasonable, but don't leave it open-ended. And it can be an iterative process. It doesn't matter how much detail you write down, one of those contractors will throw in a curveball and offer something alternative. You'll either have to go back to put them in line with everyone else, so you're comparing like with like, or they'll have thought of something you hadn't and you can factor it back. We may often be asking somebody to invent something by a date, just bear in mind, and that isn't really fair and reasonable if you then back it up with a time penalty. Yeah. So preclinical phase 1. I've got an idealized synthetic route here. So raw materials can turn into intermediates or pivotal intermediates if there are several routes of synthesis. They then come together in a key intermediate, final, and then the API. So the yellow steps don't need to be carried out to GMP and could be outsourced early. As soon as you have a target family of molecules, you could perhaps think of outsourcing those things early. Best to go to people who have expertise in the chemistry. Some large pharma companies have preferred supplier arrangements where they substitute the Aldrich catalogue for Company X in India or China. Company X has no experience of this molecule or particular knowledge of long-term manufacture of it. It's a stopping point. It's curious that they're going to run their preclinical tox batches using a one-off supplier that bears no relationship to the commercial long-term. I would much prefer to go to people who make similar molecules and could make this one too. More about that in a moment. Anyway, the GMP steps I've highlighted in pink. These are the highest added value steps. These are the things that really will dictate impurity profile. You might be able to switch routes of synthesis here. It's more and more dangerous as you approach the API. Okay, and I might tolerate some chromatography early on, but it's very dangerous here because you might take out an impurity that otherwise would carry through. Better to qualify it in tox at the start of the process, or find out that your route of synthesis is non-viable because of genotoxins, than to waste a valuable year and £1 million qualifying an inappropriate material, battery material. Okay? So we outsource the early stages quickly. That means that we can do the early stages in parallel. That helps truncate timelines. We may have backup suppliers. If we keep in track with these people through telecoms, we can bring a plan B supplier of that material in whilst we are still going through the 3-month iteration with the GMP manufacturer to sort the contract out. A single source may be faster in the short term, but multiple sources give you security and a cost advantage. And buying the wing pieces from 2 separate suppliers helps to set things in motion for the longer term when the volumes increase. If you've got all your eggs in that one basket and you go to a kilo lab supplier, you may be spending a quarter of a year chugging through batches of material in the same 50-litre pot, where 2 other companies could have been doing things in parallel, and you would have truncated timelines to 3 months. To 2 months, something like that. You can switch some horses in case of non-delivery and be very careful about promises from agents. John touched on this again this morning. You need to know who made it, where, and what their future capacity is. Otherwise, you have no control over the impurity profile in the longer term. Okay? By all means, use a contractor's outsourcing team, but that doesn't mean you don't bother inquiring yourself. And frequently, the outsourcer contracting team have simply gone to an agent. And they have buying power. You want to make use of that if possible, but if they hit trouble, as people do all the time, then you need to bring other players in. Okay, so the early phase contracts, they've got to capture the chemical and analytical development. This is IP. This is core to what you're going to sell. We need a technical agreement for GMP, which establishes clear responsibilities of all parties, and we want to avoid problems later and the finger pointing. We need flexibility in the early days. Yield ranges, John, you touched on this, perhaps for a fixed cost, so plus minus 10%, not unreasonable. If I need 5 kilos as the drop-dead quantity for the tox run, then 5 kilos plus contingency, please, so that you deliver me at least 5 kilos by this date. There's often a time-based penalty because the slot's been booked. The CEO has announced to the world that we're going to be in the clinic by Easter. Well, that means the tox house has got to accept material by a date in February at the very latest, or else. Okay, and get a man in the plant if you can. 2 reasons. 1, to follow the process and look for where the process development needs are next time around. Friend and colleague Steve Ruston, who was recently with Prolysis, used to have a lovely saying in a previous company that he didn't see why development chemists should escape the consequences of their processes. And there was no substitute for experience like trying to filter toothpaste to teach them the importance of crystallization. Okay, so if there's something awry with the processing, it is human nature for the customer to blame the contractor. If there's one of your own team in the plant watching it at the time, he or she can defend the honour of the contractor at the project team meeting and point out, actually, we need to spend a bit of money fixing this problem. So it does have benefits to the CMO as well. It's all summed up in communication, collaboration and compromise. In the early phases, maybe you can't have exactly what you want, but with a good contractor, you'll get advice as to how to get out of the mess and work things in a positive manner. So the early phase, get those analytical methods. You've got to know what's happening when and be able to follow it. Do you use test materials versus specifications? A lot of companies claim to have qualified their suppliers, and when you read between the lines, they've never tested material from the supplier. Frequently, they've never tested any material from this supplier. So quite how they've qualified a supplier of materials is beyond me. You know, at least the use test of those materials that are going into your batch will give you confidence that you're going to get out the expected product, and perhaps it's better to waste an extra day on that lab use test than waste 3 months wondering why you've got a new impurity in the batch, which ultimately gets traced down to a peculiar raw material. These things must be representative of what you want to use now and in the future, because your impurity profile is almost certainly going to be dependent on these input materials. Hold a startup meeting, get all the stakeholders around the table so you're all focusing on the same goal. Have this man in the plant during manufacture. At the end of it all, I think somebody asked this morning, do you ever audit at the end? Well, you should. You should have a closeout meeting, find out what went well, what didn't go so well, what would you change next time? Okay? Document the changes for next time. And don't forget, we're not just interested in a white powder. You know, we want kilos of paper to go with those kilos of product in the early days, because it's the recipe for manufacture that really adds the value. That is the intellectual property output which enables us to make another batch to achieve better and better results in future. So later phase, suddenly this diagram becomes more important, because the compromise should go. If you're going to bring a new supplier on, the compromises we've made here and here should perhaps not exist. We want good commercial relations. We want good quality systems. The legal needs to be sorted out. Everything needs to move away from the origin to the highest score possible, because you've got to spend money now teaching the second person how to do it. So the success criteria do go up. They should have a good regulatory history, and you assume all the early knowledge is in place. So the tox package, all of the polymorphism work needs to be fed to them. They may critique it and suggest some additional work. Well, there's no harm in that. In late phase development programs, it's quite common to look once again at polymorphs. You have more defined contracts, a per kilo basis, because you know what the outcome should be. Okay? And potential to meet commercial volumes, at least 40% of your requirements. You're bringing a second player on. I mean, okay, there are those projects where 1,000 tons may be required, for which you choose to have more than 2 suppliers, because the risk is still high. But if you're going to bring a second one on, I would advise you to have at least 40% capacity at that second supplier, assuming 60 plus at the first. And you will have to give them some business, or you haven't really got a second supplier. You've just hacked off another company with unnecessary technical detail. Much lower risk from a regulatory and supply standpoint. Focused strategic partnerships were bandied around 20 years ago, and preferred suppliers. I am ambivalent about them. Relationship building is expensive. That's a point in their favour. So you've already built the relationship. You've already perhaps established some chemistry. The prototype drug has failed. The plan B, follow-on compound, comes along. If it's the same sort of volume, same indication, fine. You don't want to up sticks and move unnecessarily. You've got an existing contractual working relationship. What about the commercial volumes? You know, is the backup compound anything you say can and will be used against it. Okay, for those of you who aren't asleep at the other end, boo. The commercial outcome may be different. We may have moved from a parenteral to an oral indication. The volumes may have increased substantially. So that existing relationship may or may not apply. Okay? Is there an incentive for competition if they know they're going to get the next project from you? Is the incentive still there to be competitive on pricing or not? Or is the differential, because of the costs already expended, such that it's better to stick with the horse that's been tried and tested? Okay? Do you want a single reliable supplier versus multiple sources? Monopolies are not renowned for competitive pricing, but a good working relationship is worth a lot. Okay, so in summary, you need to understand what you're trying to achieve and select appropriate partners because divorce is expensive. Strive for detailed process understanding. If you understand your process, you could install it anywhere if the wheel came off. Okay? Understand the contractor's aspirations. Everyone has a right to make a profit. If your contractor's not making a profit, he won't be in business next year. You won't have a supply of your API. Okay? His or her profit margin is something for him or her. If you're making a product at a profit and the price is competitive against screens of other contractors, stop worrying about it. He or she has probably got a more efficient operation. Build a strong collaborative team from both sides because this is what you're going to sell later. Okay? And a few words of advice at the end. Remember that time is money. Okay? Any questions?
Thank you very much, Paul. Some very thought-provoking questions to ask for prospective partners and possibly to ask of ourselves as well. Yes, please. First question.
Paul, you started Hash earlier mentioning about setting up supply chains early on for when the product is sold on to potentially big pharma clients. Given that those big pharma either have internal capacity that they like to use or preferred suppliers of their own, how often does that actually happen?
I can think of one very good example a couple of years back where we'd identified that the project was likely to require at least 100-ton a year capacity. So we selected 3 contender companies that we knew had a track record with Big Pharma, and then we visited the 3 and assessed how our process would fit in their facilities. One of them had inappropriate drying capability, another one wanted large sums of money spending on abatement technology for one step. But at the end of the day, the contractor we chose reduced cost of goods by 30%, increased yields, and in double-figure rounds of due diligence on the project, each big pharma company expressed no disquiet at all with that chosen manufacturer. They had used them or were aware of them in the marketplace. I don't like to use kilo lab companies because of this. You know, it's expensive. Every time you up sticks and move the process, someone else has to shoehorn the project into another plant. Well, if you can stick with one company, usually all of those limitations and corporate prejudices have been taken care of.
For quotations.